Your support keeps these stories alive. Like, subscribe, and ring the bell.
I grew up on a farm that wasn't just land. It was blood, sweat, and history pressed into the soil. My grandparents bought those 65 acres after World War II. Back then, the house was nothing more than a rotting shack, and the fields were mostly rocks and weeds. They turned it into a thriving small farm with cattle, apple orchards, and rows of corn that seemed endless when I was a child. For me, that place was more than a farm. It was my anchor. My grandfather used to tell me, "This land is our insurance against everything. As long as we have the farm, no one can ever say we're powerless." Those words burned into me. I carried them like a badge. My older brother Mark never seemed to hear them the same way. Where I saw tradition, he saw burden. Where I felt pride, he felt chains. Growing up, I was the kid who actually helped. I spent summers hauling hay, feeding livestock, sweating in the July sun until my shirt clung to me like a second skin. Mark disappeared whenever there was work. He always had an excuse: football practice, friends, or studying. My grandparents noticed, but they never called him out. He was the firstborn, the golden child. He could do no wrong. I was the one who was responsible, the one they leaned on. When Grandpa passed away, I was 24 and Mark was 27. The will left the farm jointly to both of us. That was my grandmother's idea. I think she believed equal ownership would keep the family united. United. What a cruel joke. At first, things seemed stable. Grandma stayed in the farmhouse, and I still went out every weekend to help her keep things running. Mark rarely came by, and when he did, it was usually in a shiny car, dressed like he was about to meet investors, not check on livestock. He had moved to the city, chasing big money. I didn't mind. Honestly, I preferred it that way. But things started to shift after Grandma's health declined. She passed away 3 years later, and that was when Mark showed his true colors. Within weeks, he started talking about opportunities. "Look," he told me one evening at the kitchen table, his tie loosened, sleeves rolled up like he wanted to pretend he understood hard work. "We're sitting on a gold mine here. Developers are paying insane money for land like this. Why don't we cash out, split the profit, and move on with our lives?" I laughed. Move on with our lives? My life was that farm. I told him flatly, "No, we're not selling. This land isn't just property, it's family. It's legacy." His face tightened. He leaned forward. "Legacy doesn't pay bills. Do you really want to keep patching up barns and mowing fields for the rest of your life?" I stared at him. "Yes, because that's what Grandpa built it for, not for some condo complex or another strip mall." He rolled his eyes, muttering something about me being sentimental. That night, I realized something dangerous. Mark didn't just disagree with me. He resented me. He thought I was in the way of his big payday. Months passed. I noticed strangers driving slowly past the property, men in suits with clipboards. Surveyors, I realized later, but I brushed it off, thinking they were scouting the area in general. Then came the letter. It was a thin envelope with a law firm's letterhead. Inside was a notice of sale agreement. My stomach dropped as I read the words Mark had signed a contract to sell the entire farm for $280,000. Without telling me. Without asking me. Without even mentioning it. I remember the way my hands shook so badly the paper nearly slipped to the floor. I called him immediately, voice trembling with rage. "What the hell is this? You're selling the farm? You didn't even talk to me." His response? Calm, almost smug. "It's already done," he said. "I had the legal authority. You weren't going to agree, so I took care of it. You'll get your share of the money, so stop acting like a martyr." I couldn't breathe. "You forged my consent? You signed my name?" He paused. That silence told me everything. "I handled it," he finally said. "It's better this way." I exploded. I cursed him, shouted that he had no right, that I'd never forgive him. He hung up before I was finished. That night I drove out to the farm. It was past midnight, but I needed to see it, to touch the soil, to breathe the air that had raised me. I sat on the porch steps, head in my hands, staring at the dark fields. The crickets hummed. The old barn groaned in the wind. For the first time in my life, I felt powerless. But as dawn broke, something shifted inside me. I remembered Grandpa's words. As long as we have the farm, no one can ever say we're powerless. Mark thought he could erase that with a signature, but I wasn't going to let him. So I decided I would fight, even if it meant taking my own brother to court. Filing a lawsuit against your own brother is the kind of decision that keeps you awake at night, staring at the ceiling with your chest heavy as stone. I didn't want to do it. God knows. I spent weeks convincing myself there had to be another way. But every time I picked up the phone to call Mark, the memory of his smug voice replayed in my head. It's already done. You'll get your share of the money. He didn't see what I saw. That farm wasn't a pile of dirt to be traded for a check. It was my childhood. My grandfather's hands cracked and bleeding as he fixed a fence. My grandmother waving from the porch with a plate of biscuits. It was the place where I first learned what it meant to work, to fail, and to try again. And now Mark had signed it away like it was nothing more than an old car he didn't want anymore. I hired a lawyer named Susan Harris. She was sharp, mid-40s, with a voice that cut like glass. The first time we met in her office, she listened as I poured out the whole story. She didn't even flinch when I admitted that the man I was suing was my own brother. She leaned back in her chair, tapped her pen against a legal pad, and said, "If he forged your signature or sold property without your consent as a co-owner, you've got a strong case. But you need to prepare yourself. Family cases get ugly. He'll deny it, and it'll come down to proof." "Proof?" I repeated. "Paperwork, witnesses, anything that shows you never consented." That night, I tore through the old filing cabinet at the farmhouse. Deeds, wills, tax records. I stacked them on the kitchen table until it looked like a small mountain. I found the original title with both our names clearly listed as joint owners. That was my shield. But the real smoking gun came from a notary in town who confirmed Mark had signed documents alone. No record of me ever being there. No co-signature. When I confronted Mark again, it wasn't brother to brother. It was adversary to adversary. I called him from the porch of the farmhouse. My voice shook, but not from fear, from anger. "You forged my rights," I said. "I have proof. I'm taking this to court." He chuckled, like it was all a game. "You think you can win? You don't have the money for this. Lawyers cost more than that farm's worth." That was the first time I realized how far gone he was. He didn't care about family. He cared about winning, about control. The weeks leading up to the trial were some of the loneliest of my life. Relatives who used to slap me on the back at Thanksgiving stopped answering my calls. Aunts and cousins whispered that I was tearing the family apart. They said I should just take the money and move on. Only a few understood old neighbors, the ones who'd worked the land alongside my grandparents. They told me I was doing the right thing. Still, every time I passed my mother's photo on the mantel, guilt twisted in my stomach. Would she have wanted this? The day of the first hearing, I walked into the courthouse with sweaty palms. Mark was already there, dressed in a navy suit, hair slicked back like he was auditioning for a corporate commercial. He didn't look at me. Not once. He just sat with his lawyer, whispering like they were plotting a heist. When the judge entered, I felt my pulse hammering in my ears. The air in that room was heavy, thick with tension. My lawyer stood and laid out our case. Joint ownership, lack of consent, fraudulent sale. She spoke with calm precision, every word like a nail, hammered into wood. Then it was Mark's turn. He leaned back in his chair, all false confidence, and said, "Your Honor, my brother is exaggerating. He knew about the sale. He just changed his mind when he realized how much money was involved. He's bitter because he wanted control." I wanted to leap out of my seat and scream that he was lying, but Susan's hand gripped my arm, keeping me grounded. She whispered, "Let him dig his hole." And he did, because when pressed, his story started to crack. He couldn't produce a single document with my signature. He couldn't provide a shred of evidence that I'd been involved. The judge frowned more with every answer. Still, it wasn't over. Court cases aren't like movies where the truth comes out in a single dramatic speech. They drag on. Motions, continuances, paperwork thicker than phone books. Every night, I drove back to the farm, exhausted, feeling like I was drowning in legal jargon. But the hardest part wasn't the legal fight, it was the personal one. Family dinners became minefields. At one, an aunt slammed her fork down and hissed across the table, "You're ruining everything. Do you want your brother in jail? Is that what this is about?" I stared at her, my appetite gone. "All I want is to keep the farm. That's it. He tried to steal it." She shook her head. "You always were stubborn." That night I left before dessert, driving home with tears I refused to let fall. As the case moved forward, Mark grew nastier. He left me voicemails dripping with venom. "You're pathetic. You'll lose everything. You'll crawl back begging me for forgiveness. I saved every single one. Proof of his character. Proof of who he really was." The farm became my refuge and my battlefield. Some nights I'd sit in the barn, running my hands along the rough wood beams, whispering promises to my grandparents that I'd protect what they built. Other nights, I paced the fields in the dark, rage boiling inside me, imagining what it would feel like to see Mark on the stand, forced to admit his betrayal. When the trial date was finally set, I felt both dread and relief. This was it. No more delays, no more threats. Just truth against lies. I stood outside the courthouse that morning, staring at the brick walls, the American flag flapping in the wind. My lawyer turned to me and said, "This is where you either save the farm or you lose it forever. Are you ready?" I swallowed hard. My hands were shaking, but my voice came steady. "Yes, I'm ready." Inside, Mark sat at the defense table, smirking like he'd already won. He didn't know that today, for the first time, the weight of his betrayal would finally start to crush him. And as I sat down across from him, I whispered to myself the same words my grandfather had told me years ago. As long as we have the farm, no one can ever say we're powerless. The morning of the trial felt like stepping into a storm I couldn't escape. My hands were clammy as I gripped the worn leather of my father's old wallet, the one thing I carried for courage. It wasn't about money anymore, it was about dignity, about defending the soil that had raised me. The courtroom was cool, almost sterile, but the tension inside it made the air thick. Mark sat across the aisle, perfectly polished in his navy suit, tie knotted so tightly it seemed to choke the life out of him. He didn't look at me, not once. That stung more than I expected. He was my brother, and now we were strangers locked in a war neither of us could walk away from. The judge, an older man with silver hair and a voice like gravel, opened the proceedings. My lawyer, Susan, rose to speak first. Her words were precise, steady, like the measured strokes of a hammer driving nails into wood. "Your Honor, my client is here because his brother sold property that legally belongs to both of them, without consent, without notice, and with fraudulent signatures. We intend to prove that this sale was illegal and must be overturned." She handed the judge a stack of documents. The deed with both our names, the original will, the farm's tax records. Each paper was a reminder that I had a right to stand here. Then it was Mark's lawyer's turn. A slick man with slicker hair, he stood with a rehearsed smile. "This case is nothing but resentment, Your Honor. My client acted in the best interest of both parties. His brother was informed of the sale. He simply regrets his decision and now seeks to punish my client with baseless accusations." I clenched my jaw. Informed? I was blindsided, but I forced myself to stay silent. Susan had told me, "Anger is their trap. Don't fall for it." The witnesses began. First, the notary who confirmed Mark had signed everything alone. She testified calmly, stating no second party was present. The judge's eyebrow rose at that. Then came the county records clerk, verifying that no co-owner's approval had been filed. Piece by piece, our case built like a wall. When it was my turn, I walked to the stand with my chest heavy but my back straight. The bailiff swore me in. "Mr. Thompson," Susan began, Did you at any point agree to sell your share of the family farm? No, I said, my voice stronger than I expected. Never. That farm is my life. I would never sell it. And did your brother consult you before signing this agreement? Not once. I found out through a legal notice. That was the first I heard of it. I felt Mark's eyes burning into me, but I didn't look at him. I stared at the judge, at the jury, at anyone who could understand the weight of what I was saying. Cross-examination was brutal. Mark's lawyer tried to paint me as bitter, as someone clinging to the past. Isn't it true, Mr. Thompson, that the farm is barely profitable? It's true, it isn't about profit, I shot back. It's about family, about legacy. So you admit the farm is a burden financially? No, I said firmly. A burden is something you want to get rid of. I don't. I take care of it because it matters. His smirk faltered for just a second, but it gave me strength. Then came the moment I had dreaded Mark taking the stand. He walked up confidently, like a man giving a sales pitch. Mark, his lawyer began, can you explain why you sold the farm? Mark leaned forward, speaking with faux sincerity. I wanted to secure a future for both of us. My brother doesn't understand business. The farm is dying, and I found a way to give us both financial freedom. And did your brother know about this? Yes, Mark said smoothly. We discussed it. He just doesn't want to admit it now. My blood boiled. Discussed it? That was a lie, so bold it almost stunned me. Susan stood for cross-examination. She was calm, almost gentle at first. Mr. Thompson, can you show us any document, any email, any record at all, where your brother agreed to this sale? Mark hesitated. Just a flicker, but I saw it. Well, no formal record. But he knew. And yet, Susan pressed, the notary testified you signed alone. The clerk testified there was no co-owner approval. Isn't it true that you deliberately excluded your brother? Mark's mask cracked. His jaw tightened, and he snapped. He was never going to agree, so I had to make the decision myself. The courtroom went silent. The words hung in the air like a confession. The judge leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Mr. Thompson, are you saying you knowingly ignored the legal requirement of joint consent? Mark stammered. I was acting in good faith, but the damage was done. His arrogance had slipped, and everyone saw it. When the session adjourned that day, I walked past him without a word. For the first time, his eyes met mine. They weren't smug anymore. They were cold, angry, desperate. He muttered under his breath, "You'll regret this." But I didn't feel fear. For the first time in months, I felt something else, hope. That night, I drove back to the farmhouse and stood under the wide sky. The stars stretched endlessly above me, just as they had when I was a boy lying in the fields. I whispered to my grandparents, I'm fighting for you, for all of us. I won't let him win. The war wasn't over. There were still motions, hearings, and the final ruling to come. But now the truth had cracked open, and once it spills into the light, it can't be buried again. After Mark's slip on the stand, the air in the courtroom changed. For the first time, I saw doubt flicker across the judge's face when my brother spoke. It should have been a victory, but walking out of that courthouse, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt heavy, like carrying a boulder on my chest. Because this wasn't over, not even close. That night, my phone lit up with messages, some from distant cousins, others from numbers I didn't even recognize. Most weren't supportive. Why are you dragging this through the mud? You're embarrassing the family. Just take the money and let it go. It stung. These were people who had eaten at our table, who'd run through the fields at summer picnics. Now they treated me like I was the villain, like I was the one tearing everything apart. At dinner a few days later, my Aunt Clara finally exploded. She slammed her wine glass down so hard the stem cracked. You're destroying your own brother! She spat across the table. Do you think your grandparents would want this circus? You're dragging our name through the mud. I set my fork down, my appetite gone. Do you think Grandpa would have wanted his farm sold to strangers? Do you think he worked his whole life so some developer could bulldoze his fields, For another row of ugly houses? Clara's lips thinned. At least then we'd all get something out of it. Instead, you're bleeding us dry with lawyers and drama. We? I shot back. You weren't the one out there baling hay at dawn. You weren't fixing fences when they broke. Don't talk to me about we. The table went silent. Even the clatter of silverware stopped. I stood and walked out before the weight of their stares crushed me. The next week was worse. Mark called me late one night, his voice low, simmering with rage. You think you won in there? He hissed. You humiliated me. You think the judge cares about your sob story? You're nothing without that land, and when it's gone, you'll be nothing again. I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles turned white. You tried to steal from me, from us. You betrayed everything this family stood for. He laughed a bitter, hollow sound. You never understood. It's not about the family. It's about survival. Money talks. And when this is over, you'll see you wasted everything. I hung up, but the echo of his words lingered like poison. Some nights, I questioned myself. Was I clinging too tightly to something already slipping away? I'd stand in the dark fields, listening to the wind whistle through the corn, asking the shadows if I was right. The silence never answered. But then I'd remember the smell of fresh hay, my grandfather's calloused hands guiding mine on the plow, my grandmother's voice humming hymns as she shelled beans on the porch. That wasn't just nostalgia, it was proof of who I was, proof of why I had to fight. As the final hearings drew closer, the farm itself began to feel like a battlefield scarred by the war. Developers still drove by, slow and hungry, like vultures circling. Neighbors dropped hints. Heard the land's up for sale, shame about the fight. I'd just nod, pretending their words didn't cut. Susan worked tirelessly, preparing me for the final ruling. The judge has what he needs, she said one evening, papers spread across her desk. He heard your brother admit he acted without consent. He saw the lack of documentation, but judges are human. He'll weigh everything, the law, the family history, the credibility. Don't expect fireworks. Expect finality. Finality. The word chilled me, because finality meant one of two things. Either I'd keep the farm, or I'd watch it slip away forever. On the eve of the last day in court, I couldn't sleep. I walked the fields, the grass wet against my boots, the barn looming in the moonlight like a sentinel. I touched the old wood, whispered to the shadows. Tomorrow decides it all. In the distance, headlights flashed on the dirt road. A car slowed, then stopped. My heart kicked. Mark's black sedan. He stepped out, tie undone, hair disheveled. We stood staring across the field, just the two of us, the silence thick as the night. You could end this, he said finally, his voice rough. Drop it. Take the money. Walk away. I shook my head. No. His jaw tightened. For a second, I saw something in his eyes, desperation, fear, maybe even regret. But then it hardened. Fine. Then tomorrow, you'll lose more than you think. He turned, got in his car, and drove off, the taillights vanishing into the dark. I stood there, the crickets chirping, the night pressing down on me. His threat clung to me like smoke. What did he mean? What more could I lose? The answer would come soon enough, because tomorrow wasn't just another hearing. It was the day everything broke. The final day of the trial dawned gray, with clouds hanging heavy like the sky itself was holding its breath. I barely touched breakfast. My hands shook as I buttoned my shirt, but my mind was sharper than it had been in weeks. This was it, the moment where everything would either crumble or stand firm. At the courthouse, I walked past reporters' vans parked outside, their cameras pointed like rifles waiting to fire. Our small-town feud had become gossip worth broadcasting. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Relatives, neighbors, even strangers curious to see a family tear itself apart over land. I could feel their eyes on me as I sat down. Mark walked in minutes later, his jaw tight, his face pale but composed. He looked straight ahead, never acknowledging me. He was a stranger now. The brother I once knew was buried under ambition and greed. The judge entered, his robe trailing as silence fell over the room. He cleared his throat, shuffling papers with deliberate slowness, as if he enjoyed watching us squirm. This court has reviewed the evidence presented in the case of Thompson versus Thompson, he began, his voice low but resonant. At issue is the attempted sale of jointly owned property without mutual consent. The evidence shows clearly that only one co-owner signed the agreement. Testimony confirmed the absence of the second party. Further, Mr. Mark Thompson admitted under oath that he proceeded knowing his brother would not agree. The room was dead silent. I gripped the edge of the table so hard my knuckles turned white. The judge looked up, his eyes cutting through the tension. This court finds the sale to be invalid. The contract is hereby voided. Ownership remains joint. Furthermore, given the breach of fiduciary duty, Mr. Mark Thompson is barred from initiating any sale of the property without his brother's explicit consent. The words hit me like a tidal wave. Relief surged, overwhelming, almost painful. I'd done it. The farm was safe. But before I could even breathe, the judge continued. That said, the court strongly encourages mediation between the parties to resolve future disputes. This level of hostility within a family is regrettable. He banged his gavel, and just like that, it was over. The courtroom erupted into whispers. Some people looked at me with sympathy, others with cold disapproval. My Aunt Clara shook her head, muttering about shame. But I didn't care. My grandparents' farm, the soil, the barn, the fields, was still ours. Mark stood slowly, his face red, his eyes burning holes into me. He walked over, ignoring his lawyer's hand on his arm. "This isn't over," he hissed, his voice trembling with rage. "You humiliated me. You think you won, but you just made an enemy for life." I met his gaze, steady this time. For once, I wasn't the younger brother cowering under his shadow. "No, Mark, I didn't make an enemy. You did that yourself the day you betrayed our family." His mouth twisted, and for a second, I thought he might swing at me right there in front of everyone. But he didn't. He turned, stormed out, and slammed the courtroom door so hard it rattled the frame. I sat down, my chest rising and falling like I'd run miles. Susan leaned close, her voice softer than it had ever been. "You did it. You saved it." I nodded, but the victory tasted bittersweet. Because while I had saved the farm, I had lost my brother. That night, I drove out to the farmhouse, the dirt road crunching beneath my tires. The fields stretched out, calm under the fading light. I walked up to the porch, sat on the steps where I'd once sat as a boy, and let the silence wash over me. The farm was safe, but nothing else was the same. Family dinners would never feel whole again. Holidays would be fractured, conversations strained. I had won the land, but the cost was blood. Still, as the stars emerged, I felt something stir inside me, a quiet strength. I whispered into the night, the same words I'd carried since I was a boy. "As long as we have the farm, no one can ever say we're powerless." I realized then that I wasn't powerless. I had fought. I had endured. And though I'd lost my brother to greed, I had kept alive the legacy my grandparents had entrusted to us. The farm stood behind me, weathered but unbroken, just like me. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.